Granblue Fantasy Versus, based on the popular Granblue Fantasy universe, one of the biggest IPs in Japan, not so big here in the West, is for the first time a playable console game, and it's in the form of a fighting game by Arc System Works. The game's clearly built in a way that welcomes fans of the Granblue Fantasy mobile game and encourages fighting game fans to get into this Granblue Fantasy universe. But can the game stand on its own? In this video, we'll talk about the game's mechanics, the RPG mode, the online experience, and more. My name is Globku, and this is my review of Granblue Fantasy Versus.
Believe in victory. Battle 1. Engage!
Granblue Fantasy Versus is a one-on-one fighting game developed by Arc System Works. Unlike many of their previous titles, gameplay on this one is a bit slower. Combos aren't nearly as crazy and movement is much more grounded without the ability to double jump or air dash. If I had to compare it to any other fighting game in the market, I'd say it's much more similar to a Street Fighter than any other game made by ArcSys in the past. That's not to say you don't have devastating combos in this game. In the right situation, you can easily melt over half a health bar. But combos like this are much more situational than their previous fighting games. Mechanics-wise, it's a much simpler game too. Every character has 3 attack buttons with a light, a medium, and a heavy attack. On top of that, they also have a unique ability button that does something different depending on the character you pick. There's only a single bar of meter, and it's only useful when it's full. Its only purpose is to launch super attacks. Special moves can be found next to the meter, and they're on a cooldown system when you use their EX versions. You can also trigger the cooldowns if you decide to do these inputs with a shortcut. You see, in order to welcome new fighting game players or people from the mobile game, instead of doing quarter circle or DP motions to execute these special moves, you can simply press the shortcut with the direction, and you'll get that same special move. Though it does have its downsides. The ability will have a bigger cooldown, and that's the first downside. Supers deal less damage if done with the easy input, and some special moves too. For instance, La Diva has a command grab that's done with a 360-degree motion, so doing it with just a shortcut is a huge advantage in this case. So not only do you get the cooldown increased, the damage isn't as big either, but still, it's a great mechanic to welcome new players who aren't used to these motions and slowly ease them into the game. Heck, even I mash easy inputs sometimes when I'm trying to DP someone. It's much easier to press forward and the shortcut than execute a DP motion on a small gap. So sometimes, I confess, I use those shortcuts too, especially when picking up a new character. When I'm still not sure if I want to learn this new character, instead of memorizing their move list, I can just start by trying them out with easy inputs. It gives me a feel of what to expect out of them and slowly get used to their moves. Overall, I think the game did a great job of balancing these two ways of executing special moves, and it ends up being useful in multiple ways, not just to onboard new players. There are a few other beginner-friendly mechanics. For instance, the light, medium, and heavy attack buttons all go into a 3-hit auto combo if you're close to your opponent. And that's because every character has 2 attacks per button. One if they're close to the opponent, and another one if they're far away. And if they're close, you can mash any of the buttons for a 3-hit combo that you can then link into specials or supers. This has been a bit weird for me to get used to. Sometimes the distance is just ambiguous enough that I can't tell if I'm gonna pull off the close range or the long range move, and that paired with the cooldowns that I need to keep track of has been the biggest challenge to overcome when trying to master this game. But it's all a part of learning a new fighting game, getting used to its mechanics that are different from what you're used to. It's not necessarily something negative, but something you should expect if you pick up this game as well. And then defensively, the game also has a couple of options. First of all, you can block by holding back, or you can simply press the block button. There's no big disadvantage to holding block, except that if you're holding it, you can't tech throws. And also, if you're holding the block button and press a direction, your character will either do a roll or a spot dodge, depending on the direction you press. Getting used to blocking with the directions and the block button on different occasions was something that I thought was going to be tricky, but ended up being quite natural for me. In this version of the game, the block button is also causing some problems. You're able to execute some pretty broken stuff thanks to it, but it's already been announced that in March a patch will fix all of that. So I'm just going to assume that none of that is in the game in the future, and I'm going to ignore that as I score this game at the end of the video. And just to wrap up the fighting system before we move on to game modes, the launch roster features 11 characters with one more coming in March. This extra character can be bought as DLC, but you can also get it for free if you beat the RPG mode. So you can think of this as a $60 fighting game with 12 characters. 12 characters is not unprecedented. Fighting games have had this roster count in the past, but it's definitely on the low end, and it feels especially insulting when they've already announced not 1, but 2 upcoming season passes, bringing a total of 10 more characters into the game. Feels a little money grubby, and in a way also feels like a legacy of what Granblue Fantasy is. The big draw of the mobile game are the characters of this franchise, so the more you have on the base game, the less you have for DLC, which makes me feel really not okay with this roster size at launch. But let's move on to game modes, starting with the single player content. First up, we have the RPG mode, which is this game's story mode. Since this is the first Granblue Fantasy console game, what I expected out of this story mode was a great introduction to this franchise, bringing people who know nothing about Granblue Fantasy into this universe, and the game met those expectations so perfectly that it reminded me why I'm not a Granblue Fantasy fan. The story takes place well after what I've watched of the anime, but does a good job of introducing you to its different characters through dialogue and flashbacks. By the time you're done with this RPG mode, you'll know exactly what these guys are all about. And if you have any further lore questions or some confusing term pops up during the story, you can always check the glossary, as it is one of the most complete sources of info I've seen for Granblue Fantasy yet. And don't get me wrong, characters are definitely the strong point of Granblue Fantasy. It's always interesting when someone new comes along. Their character design is enough to make anyone curious about what their deal is. But then the overall story is a mix of generic fantasy and shonen tropes, mixed with the constant teasing of interesting concepts that are never fully explored. If you don't know Granblue Fantasy, imagine One Piece. The crew flies from island to island and they want to reach the end of the skies, just like Luffy wants to find the One Piece and become the Pirate King. The problem is, once they accomplish their goal, the series is over, and their multi-billion-dollar franchise ceases to be interesting. So there can never be any significant progress towards that goal, and the whole experience ends up feeling empty, because you come out of it from the other end feeling like you didn't do anything. The world is still the same place it was at the start of the game. And that's not really the game's fault, that's just how Granblue Fantasy goes. And if anything, the game captured that extremely well. Gameplay-wise, RPG mode is interesting and compelling. Missions have enough variety to keep the whole thing fresh. From fighting waves of weak mobs to fighting other characters from the roster and bigger boss battles with different phases. The story itself takes about 10 hours to complete, but this mode is a big RPG where you can spend a lot more time than that if you want to unlock everything. And even if you don't care about the single player content, you might want to unlock stuff here, because this is where you unlock character colors and weapon skins that you can use in multiplayer. And some of those skins are buried pretty far into the late game. Your characters level up, and throughout your adventure you also get a ton of weapon drops. These weapons go into these grids that you can then level up each weapon with money. You can increase their level cap with duplicates, and they have different rarities. And yes, you guessed it, you get more of these golden ones once you beat the game. There are actually multiple ways of getting them. One is by drawing random crystals. Yes, it's basically loot boxes, but the game does not have any microtransactions, so I guess it's fine. And the duplicates do come in handy, so there's that too. And then there's also the Babel Tower, which is a series of challenges with the higher floors giving you some unique rewards too. You can play all of this solo, with an AR partner, local co-op, or online co-op. In my opinion, having a co-op partner or even AI made the game extremely boring. The difficulty doesn't scale at all, which made playing solo my preferred method for story mode. Having another character there just made the game way too easy. But once you beat story mode, you do unlock hard difficulty, and co-op starts making a lot more sense. So overall, the RPG mode is well fleshed out. It provides a good amount of single player content that is actually entertaining. Getting new weapons and making my grid stronger and stronger, and getting a few unlocks to show off in multiplayer in the meantime has been extremely rewarding, and I loved my time with it. It also serves as a great introduction to Granblue Fantasy if you're not familiar with it. Even if I'm not the biggest fan of its stories, I'm a fan of their characters, and the gameplay kept it entertaining enough to sit through the story. The other single player mode you can find in this game is the arcade mode. This is where you pick any character you want and fight in a series of battles against the CPU until you reach the final boss. Once you defeat it, you get a piece of custom art featuring that character. Arcade mode does a neat thing where after each battle you can pick who you fight against next, as well as their difficulty. You can try to fight someone harder or lower the difficulty as you go. If you lose, your score goes down to 0 and you won't get that high score. The reward for beating arcade mode is, in my opinion, not enough to feel rewarding. You're fighting the CPU, which is inherently not as interesting as fighting other players, and your reward is an image. Arcade mode feels boneless because of this. Even with you being able to choose the difficulty between fights, which is indeed interesting and keeps it challenging, the reward just isn't good enough. But let's move on to online matches. There are a couple of ways to play other people online, but let's start by talking about something that's common across all of those ways: the online netcode. Granblue Fantasy Versus uses a delay-based netcode that's very common in fighting games made in Japan. Being an advocate for rollback type netcodes, I went in with pretty low expectations. And that said, this netcode isn't as bad as I thought. It's more in line with the BB Tag netcode, making it something better than Dragon Ball FighterZ, for instance. But this is a game where sometimes you're confirming a single hit into a special attack, whereas in BB Tag, you can mash a button to get an auto combo, making the confirms a lot easier. Delay in this game affects neutral and hit confirms a lot more than in BB Tag, simply because of how the game itself works. That said, playing matches in 1, 2, 3 frames delay still makes the game very playable. You can react to most of the universal mix-up options, and you can for the most part execute the tech that you've been practicing offline. So unless you're fighting against someone from across the globe, or someone rocking a very shaky Wi-Fi, the experience isn't perfect, but it's definitely passable. There are a couple of options for playing other people online. You can just queue up for ranked matches, join an online lobby, or make your own private lobby and invite your friends. For ranked matches, you can set up some connection restrictions and search for players around your level, or even search for a challenge. When you win a ranked match, you usually get one of these crystals unless the opponent you defeated was at a rank much lower than yours, and if you lose a ranked match, you will lose one of these crystals. Once you have 0 or all 5 of them lit up, you will rank down or you will rank up. It's a fairly straightforward ranked system, exactly what you want out of a fighting game like this. If you don't want to play ranked and just want to enjoy some casual matches, this is when you join an online lobby. Here you will find a ton of these virtual arcade machines, and to play against other players, simply join one of those arcades and wait for someone else to join you. These are casual matches, no points are gained or lost, but you do get a currency which can be used to buy new lobby avatars and colors. Finally, the private lobbies are limited to 9 players. Once you make one, you'll find a few arcade cabinets for you to fight against each other, and even set custom rules like an extended timer or best of 5 rounds. Overall, the online game modes have everything you'd want out of a fighting game. I can find no faults in the online experience outside of the netcode, which is one of its pillars. But hey, someday, rollback will be the standard, or we can at least hope. But before you jump into the online, you should at least practice your character for a bit. And the game does offer some decent tutorials as well as a robust training mode. There are several missions to complete in mission mode that teach you everything from general mechanics, character abilities, and character combos. You can even find some specific matchup options and how to counter them. It won't teach you everything you need to know or the most optimal combos. For that, you're still gonna have to look online, but it's a great starting point when picking up a new character. It gives you some idea of how they work, gives you ideas for combos, and even if you don't take that tech into a match, combo challenges are always fun to complete when they're challenging enough. And then you have the training mode, which has got pretty much everything you'd want. You can set up your opponent to always block, to only block the initial hit. You can set up multiple reversal options like what they do after getting knocked down, what they do after blocking an attack, and then have all of those reversal options active in simultaneous. You can also record some specific actions and then play them back for when you're trying to figure out how to counter some ability or setup, or simply practicing your defensive skills, because you can set up multiple recordings and then tell the CPU to play them back randomly. It's a very complete training mode. Lab monsters are absolutely going to love it. And finally, the last topic on this review is presentation. The game looks great. From character models to special attack animations, it's got what Arc System Works has gotten us used to. It is gorgeous. The stages themselves are beautiful without being distracting, and every stage has a transition when a fight goes into round 3, and that's a neat little touch. Even the cutscenes during RPG mode look great. And then the soundtrack is so good, it surpassed all my expectations. It's extremely varied, covering a wide range of genres, and not only does it fit the vibe of the game perfectly, it's so good I've been listening to it outside the game. With all that said, it's time to score this game. If you're new here, we use letters for our scores. F and E are the bad games, D and C are okay, and B and A are the good games. And this is my score for Granblue Fantasy Versus.
Whenever the unloved can't find their place, I'll be there to show them their own worth.
I really like this game, and if you've paid attention to the review, there are very little flaws I pointed out. This game has everything a fighting game should have, except for a couple of details. The thing is, those details are kinda big. The roster size and DLC plans feel a bit insulting given the price tag, and the netcode is still delay-based, which honestly is a flip of a coin. One match, it will be fine, the next might be atrocious, and that affects the entire online experience. But that doesn't take away from this game's achievements. The mechanics are solid, the game is fun and very complete, no matter what type of fighting game player you are. It is welcoming to beginners, it's got a robust single-player experience for those looking to learn more about Granblue Fantasy, and its training and online modes should satisfy even the most veteran players. That said, this is my opinion, I'd love to hear yours. Let the people know what you think of the game, so if someone comes to this video wondering if they should buy the game or not, they have my opinion, but they can read yours as well. And as always, thank you very much for watching. My name is Globku, and I'll see you next time. Bye!